Hey everybody, Mary Fran Bontempo here. And before we get started with this week's episode, did you know that Brilliantly Resilient can come directly to you? That's right, we have keynotes, programs, presentations, workshops, all available to companies, associations, conferences, and organizations, either virtually or live in person. So head on over to brilliantlyresilient.net at the speaking tab to find out more. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our weekly Brilliance Bit, which comes to you once a week directly to your inbox and has a bit of brilliance from this week's show and will keep you living in a brilliantly resilient mindset. Okay, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. What's your train wreck? Everyone has one. The question is, are you going to live there or are you just visiting? Let's check in with Mary Fran and Kristen to learn how to come through not broken, but brilliant.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Brilliantly Resilient Live. I have a lovely young lady today who is with me, and I'm so interested in what Cole Aansen is going to be talking to us about because it's about literacy, but in relation to dyslexia. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to go out on a limb here and say everybody knows at least somebody who has had this situation. And it's particularly challenging if you're a parent and you have a child with this. So she is a certified literacy intervention teacher. She has degrees from all over. I want to read you for us a real quick second, if I can find it here in my notes. Cole's background. She has an undergraduate degree in linguistics. She has a master's of education in children's literature and literacies. And she says for the last few years, she's taught a certified Orton Gillingham approach to teaching reading and spelling for kids with dyslexia. I'm super interested to dive into this. So Cole, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary Fran. I'm so happy I get to talk to you about literacy and how parents can help their children read better.
You know, this is in most parents' mind, it's a given. Your kids get to a certain age and they learn how to read. And most of us, there's so much obviously to think about when you become a parent, but most of us, that's not on the list. That's just something that's supposed to happen. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about your story and how you got into this arena. And then I want to get into we talk on Brilliantly Resilient about sucker punches, and that is a sucker punch for a parent when their kid has difficulty reading. So, how did you get into this world?
I was talking to someone yesterday about how when I was 15, I took one of those personality tests that said just adjectives about you, whatever strengths and weaknesses. And they said, "You're going to be a teacher." And I said, "Absolutely not." Fast forward, it's really the only thing I've ever done. Yes, I worked in customer service, that sort of thing, but I started teaching ESL. The people who worked in the cafeteria at Northeastern, I was delighted to figure out how to teach just basic English lessons for them. That was just a volunteer thing. From there, I went on to teach English composition and testing for English as a second language so that people could go on to do master's degrees and PhDs whose native language was not English. And then I went on to teach Spanish. I taught Spanish at a language immersion camp a couple of times, and I taught English in Moscow for a year after
And
I
you
graduated.
speak like four languages, right? You speak quite a few languages.
I do. When you do linguistics, it's really science of language. So all the pieces of language, but it turns out that a lot of students who study linguistics also really enjoy learning languages. So you take a lot of classes, have a lot of opportunities.
Well, it's funny because I'm doing the whole Duolingo thing and trying, and it really is fascinating, and it's quite the opportunity to get to know another culture a little bit and take part in that, which also adds to all of this as well. So when the interest in the dyslexia and this Orton Gillingham, I'm so interested in this method because of the way it sounds like this approach works. So when did all that begin for you?
Orton Gillingham, or OG for short, is the method, and it is absolutely fantastic. When I was back in Ohio for a bit, My former school, I grew up in Montessori school. My former school called me and said, "Hey, we heard you're in town. We need a literacy teacher. It doesn't have to be forever, but maybe till the end of the school year. Are you interested?" I didn't know how to teach somebody how to read, and thus brings up the main question is how do you teach someone how to read
Mm.
and spell? And before I got into teaching literacy, I didn't necessarily equate reading and spelling. I thought those were separate things. It just never occurred to me. And I'm not a parent yet, but I can imagine how, like you said, parents don't necessarily think that reading is going to be something that they are going to have to step in and work with. Um, so I went and the state of Ohio sent me to get trained. And the first day of the 3-day training in Orton Gillingham, it was like fireworks. The just neurons were firing in my brain with not only can Orton Gillingham work with students with dyslexia, it can teach anyone how to read. It could be adapted for teaching ESL so that rather than teaching, as you know from doing your Duolingo and probably numerous classes in school as well, languages like foreign languages taught like, okay, now we're going to do all the places in the town, or today we're going to do all the food. You could take Orton Gillingham and teach foreign language from a sound perspective, taking the different spellings like EA says E and doing an entire list of vocabulary with words that have EA says E and work on all the different spelling rules and pronunciation rules that would then allow somebody to be much more fluent much more quickly. So in addition to foreign language and then ESL, it could also be used for adult education. Perhaps somebody who is currently incarcerated who would like to learn learn how to read and spell better, somebody who'd like to enter the workforce afterwards, go get their GED, whatever college, whatever it be. You can't really do much with education beyond high school without literacy. So it's
So
absolutely endless. So I
I
went on to
just
get
always
certified.
I I just always thought of spelling as something annoying that I wasn't exactly great at, but that I had to do to pass the spelling test. But I was reading about this approach, and first of all, it says it's a multisensory approach, which fascinates me. But now here's the thing that I had no understanding of. Cognitive science for the intervention sphere. Like that just sounds like made up words. So explain to me words that somebody picked. Okay, they sound smart. Let's put them together. Explain to me in either order what cognitive science for the intervention sphere is and what the multisensory approach is.
Sure. Intervention sphere, referring to any of the additional education that somebody might need to receive outside of traditional schooling. So, most parents send their child to school, they go to classes, they get shuffled from subject to subject, they come home, they do their homework, they don't get any additional tutoring, and they may not get pulled out of class to do one-on-one tutoring for whatever it may be. There are all kinds of things that could require intervention. Somebody else coming in and saying, we need to work extra on whatever it is. In my case, reading and spelling. But for somebody else, maybe there would be something math related. Maybe there would be
Mhm.
something executive function related, which is organization, being able to organize one's tasks, get the homework done, that sort of thing. There's actually a lot of intervention that happens that I didn't know anything about before I got into this. When it comes to cognitive science and Orton Gillingham being based in cognitive science, that's just brain science. When it comes to multisensory, um, if you think of a traditional classroom setting, if you were to Google like stock photography of a classroom, you'd see one person standing at the front of a classroom with a massive board and all these little desks all facing in that direction, and they're sitting there listening. And there's not a lot apart from the sense of hearing and listening that somebody's getting when it comes to traditional instruction. So with multisensory education, you're involving the body, and that's why OG works. It is so cool. So you've got two hemispheres of your brain. Someone with dyslexia, which did I tell you what percentage of the population
No,
is?
and I do want to talk about that because I think this is way more common than people realize, and people, especially a number of adults for whom this was not diagnosed when they were younger. who always struggled and just felt like they didn't get it. But
Yeah,
this is clearly something that we really need to pay attention to.
it is. So research suggests now that about 20% of the population,
Wow.
regardless of uh, race, socioeconomic status, um, ethnic background, anything, it just is a human trait
So
in
none of those other things seem to matter. It's just that's the way certain brains are born
process. That's
and
right. And
processed.
dyslexia isn't seeing words backwards as a lot of people assume. When I do these events and I talk to people about dyslexia and they're like, "Oh, is that seeing words backwards, right?" It's like, "Not exactly." It's about language processing. So people with dyslexia have a larger right hemisphere. And when you have these two halves of the brain, when we learn, we're looking to create as many pathways between the two hemispheres as we can. That's called an integrated brain. And when you learn with multisensory techniques and strategies, you actually create more pathways between those hemispheres. It's very cool. So for example, we in English we have phonetic words, which are words that can be sounded out. You know that EA says E. The word peach, you can sound that, well, you learn how to sound that out. It's P, E, Ch, peach. When you blend it, you have words that are non-phonetic, like the word what, WHAT. It sounds like it should be WUT, but it's not.
Yes.
So we have to learn those differently, and we have multisensory techniques to do both. For the phonetic stuff, there's finger tapping, where, and I don't have my, it's hard to show without a flat surface, but you're essentially tapping out, like for example, peach would be peach, P-E-Ch, peach. And we do it flat on a surface and they're tapping and it has to do with handedness and whatever. But we use the finger tapping, we use a sand tray, which stimulates your fingertips. Sometimes you'll see, and I want to PSA, anybody who's using a sand tray and they're using a stick, like some of these sand trays you can buy that are like little kits you can buy online, they'll come with a little stick, like essentially a pencil. For writing in the sand, that is not multisensory. This is my PSA of the
Okay.
year. If you're going to do a sand tray and write sounds in the sand, for example, if I give you a sound, I say qua, the sound is qua. You repeat it and then you go to write it, you're going to write it with that fingertip because you have 10,000 nerve endings in that fingertip that then send 10,000 messages to your brain that help you learn better. So when you write Q, U says qua in the sand, you're getting a lot more out of that than if you're using that stick or if you were writing it with just a pencil. For example, with the non-phonetic words, what do? We use the letter names. So we use this screen, we are tracing with like, it's a plastic screen sort of thing, almost like a window screen in its like lattice texture. And we're tracing with that. And then when we stand up and we've got the word in front of us with those letters, for example, WHAT, we're going to be, can you see my arms? We're going to be tapping down your arm if you're a right-handed person, up your arm if you're a left-handed person, and you're going to be tapping those letters WHAT, what. And when you're crossing this midline between the two hemispheres of your brain, that also creates extra pathways. So it's very
Okay.
cool.
So wait, I have to stop you because my brain's ready to explode right now. So the tapping isn't, nor is, I would assume this, assigned to any particular letters, correct?
Mm-mm.
It's assigned to sounds, or it's not assigned, it's more like, explain this again. Explain how the tapping works with different sounds. Two different words. How does the tapping work with two different words? Is it, I guess what I'm trying to find, because my brain works in the traditional way. So I guess I'm trying to find some consistencies in how the tapping is attached, say, to letters or sounds. And maybe it's not. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it.
When it comes, the tapping has to do more with parsing out individual things. So if we're
Okay.
talking about um, finger tapping syllables, for example, you're giving one finger tap to one sound. Or
Okay.
when a student gets to a point where they're learning blends, like STR, I think I even have it here. Like STR says stra, for example, I would put stra on one finger as well. We don't want to be sounding out like in this word. Let's see if you can see that. We don't want to be sounding out
Stress,
like
right,
it's like
right.
stir. They want to say stir in that case. We want to say stress, for
Okay.
example. Really getting bunching those blends
So
together.
it's
When it comes,
combinations of sounds that are then kind of linked to the combination of the physicality of the tapping that kind of imprints in a different way in the brain.
I would say, so they say the syllable, or like they say that word, maybe stress, and they're tapping stress. Then they go to write it, and they write one sound at a time, they might, it's really common, for example, on three-letter blends to miss that, miss the T or miss the R. Say they get the R, but they miss the T. We then look at what they've written. They've written SRESS. Well, maybe they've written SS. They might need to be reminded of that doubling rule as well.
Double S.
But that's a separate spelling rule for the short vowel. But we look at that SR and we say, is that a blend we know in English? Is that a blend we have? And they will have been familiarized with all the blends that we do have. And that's not a blend we have. Maybe in
Right.
another language, but not in English. And going back to the red words and tapping the individual letters for the red word, sorry, non-phonetic words. We call them red words for short, because it's like stop, like a stop sign, like
Mm-hmm.
don't sound me out, you can't
Right,
sound.
right, right.
So tapping those individual letters down their arm, what's absolutely fascinating, and I get such a sense of satisfaction every time it happens. So when they're learning their red word and they're tracing and they're repeating and they're tapping and whatnot, it comes to a point where they turn their paper over and there's a place for them to write the word without peeking at any other reference of it. On the whiteboard, I cover it up and they go to write it. And sometimes it depends on the student too. Some students
Mhm.
are like, great, got this, done. And then they go on to write their sentence using the word and they're good to move on. Other students get to the other side of the paper and they're like, oh no, what was it?
Blank
And maybe they
page.
get like, maybe they get the first two letters. Maybe if it is what, for example, usually it's for longer ones, like nine
Hmm.
letter, 12-letter words that they're like, uh-oh. Um, but we break it up as well with, if it were like what's like though, THOUGH, I'll break it up into like two sections. If they're writing, I hear them say it THO, and then they're like, what's next? I'll say, I won't tell them what it is. I prompt them, I say, let's tap it again. I prompt them and say, and give exactly what they just gave. Maybe they just gave TH. And they're like, shoot, is it the O or the U next? Or
Hmm.
maybe something else. I start them and say TH, and then they get their arm up and they're like, okay, THOUGH, though? And they look at me and they have this question. It's like, yes, your body literally just gave you the answer. How
I
cool is that?
I just love this so much because I actually I was an education major. I'm a former grade school substitute teacher. I didn't teach full time, but back when I was in college, with the dinosaurs, they talked about they talked about multi-system types of processing. Not everybody processes in the same way and all of that. But it was more theoretical, and even at that was not nearly as evolved as this, number one. But number two, there was never mention about using your body to link things in your brain. And we're finding so much with holistic healing and all of that that we can use our bodies in other ways besides just moving.
Yeah, it's very cool. And when I teach them initially, like the finger tapping, for example, for spelling, I make them all do like the very clear, again, like this is our table, like we pound the syllable, tap it out. We have like a handprint, we trace the hand, it's numbered, it's color coded. There's like layers of visual cues that you can use and then ultimately take away as somebody gets more and more confident with what they're doing. But that's bang on the table. It's very it's kind of um there's nothing subtle about it. But then ultimately I have students who Usually once we've worked together for quite some time and they're really getting it a lot, I'll say to them, would you prefer to learn where we just tap kind of like this? That way, technically, if they're doing a test or something or they're in class, they can have their hand down by their side. They can be tapping silently, just in their head, using their hand. Nobody will notice. No one will notice. Occasionally, when I have an older student like 12, 13, I work with a lot of boys, so majority boys. So, like a 12, 13-year-old boy sometimes is absolutely fine finger tapping on the table. Sometimes he's not. And when that's the case, I start with this. And we start with the most subtle, innocuous version of every strategy that we have to make it age appropriate. And that's another thing I want to make sure to highlight because a lot of people who make materials for Orton Gillingham or for just teaching reading and spelling and handwriting stuff, it's very, I guess, aimed at very young children. And that's simply not appropriate for most students who are struggling with reading later because when you do letter reversals, like you're reversing B and D, for example, or numbers are backwards, whatever, that's considered normal through first grade. You
Mm-hmm.
get into second, you get into third, fourth, fifth, and up, and you're still reading at a low level and you're still having a really hard time with spelling and writing composition and stringing things together. And, by that point, they're like 10, 11, 12. And those little activities, while they're really fun and cute for little kids, it's just not appropriate for older students. So that's one of my missions. That's part of my mission is to create things that are for older students so that they can get help too and not be as mortified that they need help in the first place. And I would like to go back to that part of the conversation where we talk about, um, I think, awareness and attitudes
Mm-hmm.
towards reading and home study versus what's expected in school, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Please do, because again, this is a given for most people. This, you just learn how to read. I can't imagine too many people thinking that's going to be one of the major hurdles of raising a child. We tend to think of those in other ways. So, how should parents approach this? I mean, if their kid is struggling, this ends up being one of the most basic foundational pieces of raising a successful adult. And when it's something that you kind of take for granted is going to happen and then it doesn't, I imagine a lot of parents are just like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So take us through that.
I think for some, talking about that shocking moment of, oh no,
Mm-hmm.
my child has dyslexia, or maybe they have it, well, maybe they have a diagnosis, maybe they don't, because that's another thing we should talk about at some point. But I think there are parents who are surprised, certainly, and it is a shock because it's like, great, now what do we do? They go online, and it depends on the school, depends on the state. My students, I work online now, so my students are all over the country, and parents have talked to me about what their different states offer for accommodations for their child to get extra time on tests, for example, or to be able to have a test read out loud to them and be able to answer verbally.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, the kid always knows it. They always know all the
Right.
information. Perfect. When they go to write it and have to waste a lot of time reading it, they get very low scores, but that's not an accurate representation of what they actually know. Um, so you have parents who are shocked, I think, and I can't even, I mean, I can imagine, but I also can't imagine in a sense that well, like I say, I do imagine, I don't have children yet. I imagine that when I have children, you don't think about all the extra things you might have to do. You don't think about um, things that you consider to be a given. Like you said, reading and spelling, school things tend to be considered a given in
Mm-hmm.
our country. You also have parents, I think, who aren't surprised because their child maybe learned to speak later than they were expecting. Maybe they suspected that there was something processing related going on because along with dyslexia come other things.
Mm-hmm.
sometimes dysgraphia, often dysgraphia, which is really essentially the same thing but for writing, spelling, the actual like orthography. Um, you get dyspraxia, you get executive functioning things, like I said earlier, with organization. You get language processing. People go to speech language therapists. They go for hearing things. Sometimes people also have eye related things, though dyslexia is not an eye condition. It really is a
Mm-hmm.
processing thing. So, I guess what I'll say is I would really like to see in my lifetime for parents going into parenthood to have a slightly, I guess, more open expectation that when you have a child, you don't necessarily know what their educational needs might be. And we live in a society
Right.
that requires reading, it requires really solid communication. Otherwise, many, many doors are closed to you. And so, um, maybe if awareness of learning differences were to become
Mm-hmm.
normalized rather than something considered to be rare and hopefully it doesn't happen to me kind of thing,
Right.
right? Which is understandable. Nobody wants to have to see their child struggle. Nobody wants to expect that either. That's absolutely understandable. But perhaps we can change how we how we expect our children to be, I
Hmm.
guess. Just be
That's
open,
very
finding
profound,
out.
how we expect our children to be. And quite honestly, that that little piece of information right there, change how we expect our children to be. Anybody who expects their kids to be anything might as well just forget it because, I always say I was the best parent in the world before I had children because my kids were going to be like this, they were going to do this, they were going to do that, and then you have them and it all goes out the window because of the physiological differences, the personality differences, everything that goes into making a human a human. But here's what I guess I'm wondering. Should the schools be preparing parents for the differences from the time kids are children? Should we be saying to parents, look, there are different ways of learning. If your child isn't getting this in a certain way, let us know. There are other ways that we can present information. Or should teachers be at the college and the educational level being taught to really be aware of how kids process different things differently? Because this is not really new news. We're not breaking new ground with this idea, but it doesn't seem to have infiltrated enough where the educational system is saying to parents, hey, it's okay. We got other ways to do this.
I would say all of the above, you know, and nothing that I'm ever aiming to put out is um, looking to point fingers at
Mm-hmm.
any one area or person or group in
Right.
particular. You know, you hear a lot of people, if you look up TED Talks about literacy, for example, they're talking about literacy just widespread, not specifically dyslexia related.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they talk more on a policy level, and they're talking about let's change the education system, which would be excellent. It would be great if schools had the awareness and teachers had the training. Well, it'd be great if
Mm-hmm.
teachers had the training how to sequentially teach reading in the first place. I think
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that is missed. Maybe they're taught to teach individual sounds and maybe some vowel teams, like OA says O. I remember getting those in school, but I never got sequential education on how to actually string everything together, as well as how to decode, which is taking a longer word, a multisyllabic word, more than one syllable, and being able to recognize that it can be broken down into pieces. Um,
Say that again. What is that called? That's called decoding.
Coding. So spelling, what we do with the finger tapping, that's technically encoding, where you're hearing something and you go and you're writing it down. Your decoding is where you're deconstructing it. Then the method that I teach, and Orton Gillingham has multiple different I guess, organizations that will teach it. It's all very similar. I've seen other people do decoding slightly differently. The method that I was taught and use, it ends up looking kind of like a math equation where you're breaking down a word. There's a formula. It's quite simple, but it's very cool and it's very powerful. But I was never taught anything like that. So,
Well,
all
again, I don't think it's about, again, you don't want to call anyone out because it's not a matter it's not even a matter of that. It's a matter of, at the very begin, at least from my perspective, and especially having grandkids now who are starting to go to school and starting to learn things, and there's a marked difference between how each of them is approaching it. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to get the message across that not everybody learns in the same way. And that's perfectly normal. It's normal. We have to stop not normalizing these things. Oh, well, you mean they can't sit in a classroom with their hands folded for 45 minutes and learn reading? Yeah. Maybe they're
yeah.
not supposed to do that. But I appreciate your message from that perspective that not everybody learns the same way. There are different ways to teach things. And again, the concept of involving the body to create new, I presume, synapses and pathways and all of that to help recall. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what this is about, right?
Absolutely. And the strategies that I teach are meant to be used as long as they need it. Some
Hmm.
people, I mean, dyslexia is not something that you get over. It's a brain processing uh, condition, I suppose you could say, or just a brain processing truth. Um, and it doesn't just go away. I meet people who are like, "Oh, my buddy was dyslexic," and
It's true.
I don't say anything. I'm like, "Oh," and I just hear their experience. But dyslexia doesn't go away. You can learn strategies. Some people who don't have it very severe, um, end up memorizing what a lot of word shapes are. Their spelling might not be great, but they do end up just memorizing and being able to read. Technically speaking, memorizing is not that's not decoding. That's not being able to read anything. It's
Hmm.
just what happens when you find new words that you've never seen before.
Right, right. What's the
So,
process for figuring that out? Right.
yeah,
And memorization doesn't allow for a process. It's there, or it's not there.
exactly. Exactly.
Wow, this has been such a fascinating conversation. As I said, I have an education degree and this was kind of out there, but it was that nebulous, people don't learn in different way in the same ways kind of thing. But to learn that there are actually strategies for incorporating all the different moving parts of both the brain and everything else in the physical body into helping people read is really groundbreaking. So I'm so happy that you joined me today. Tell everybody where they can learn more about you and your work. And I want to make sure I say it correctly. I've been taking copious notes, so I'm turning pages here. The Orton Gillingham method, because I think this is a game changer.
Yeah, some people call it a method, some people call it an approach. I'm not fussy about what you call it because it just simply works. So, I would say for anybody who is teaching anybody how to read, doesn't have to be somebody who is truly struggling with reading and spelling. It can be absolutely anybody who will be taught how to read and spell and may need some practice as well. I would highly recommend looking into Orton Gillingham. If somebody can afford a tutor and that's something that they're interested in, there will always be certified tutors. My mission now, because tutoring is expensive and going and getting certified yourself is very expensive, because there are gatekeepers, so to speak, between families being able to access the sequential approach of OG at home in a truly comprehensive way, that's my mission now, is to put out the materials and the courses so that people can access those things. So my first product that I made, I started my little company, Aansen Literacy. I took our sound cards. This is just a little prototype, but I took one of the materials that we use every single day, which is the sound cards, and I redesigned them. And the ones that was using for years were just like a blank card with just the concept on the front. It didn't have any handwriting, guiding lines. So I have the front, I have visual cues on the back, I have the concept again on handwriting, guiding lines. We've got example words, and this is just a prototype, like I say, there's going to be more in the next iteration, but
Love
I also
these.
scripted teaching notes so that people know exactly what to say, common mistakes to look for, so that they can work with somebody. Now, not everybody, not all parents learn that way either, to just read something and be able to say, okay, now I'm going to say this to my child. That's why I have a video course that goes along with it that will teach people how to do 3 of the Orton-Gillingham activities, multisensory activities that we do, so that they can target these things with their children every single day. So,
Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. I have to get a hold of the cards at the very least because like I said, I've got all these grandbabies and we got to read. We just have to read. So this is wonderful news. I'm so happy to hear this. Cole, thank you so much for joining me today. I am so appreciative of this because this is a cause that's near and dear to my heart, very much a literacy advocate as well as a voracious reader. So I am super happy to have had you with us today and sharing this information. Everybody, please check out Cole. This is all going to be shared in our show notes when this episode does come out. So everybody will get all this information. And if you do need a little bit more of a pick-me-up, you can head on over to brilliantlyresilient.net, sign up for our Brilliance Bits, of which Cole will be featured when her episode airs, and figure out a way to help yourself live a brilliantly resilient life. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Brilliantly Resilient Live.
thanks, Mary Fran.
Thanks for tuning in to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. Join our Facebook group and follow us on YouTube to be inspired with tools to reset, rise, and reveal your brilliance.